Today, few people recognize the name of my father, Reuven Shiloah, who was a man of mystery and always remained in the shadows. He played a central role in the formation of Israel's intelligence community and became the first head of the Mossad, Israel's secret intelligence service. My father, son of Rabbi Aharon Zaslansky, is born in Jerusalem in December 1909. At the age of 20, he graduates from a teacher's training college in Jerusalem.
First of all, we studied Arabic with an Arab sheikh. I think the idea was to introduce us into the culture of the Arabs through an Arab teacher. Whether that influenced Reuven to become an Arabist and to enter into the world of politics, I cannot say.
A classmate and future diplomat, Eliyahu Epstein Eilat, brings him to the home of prominent Zionist Yitzhak and Rachel Yanait Ben Tzvi. Here he meets the leading members of the Zionist community and labor movement. These meetings are to change the entire course of his life. Following the Arab riots of 1929, during which many Jews are massacred, the Zionist leadership recognizes the importance of gathering intelligence about the intentions of the Arabs in Palestine and the neighboring Arab countries. Being native-born and fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, Reuven Zaslani is picked for his first mission by the operational arm of the Jewish Agency at the age of 22.
He began his career as a part-time agent of the political department of the Jewish Agency when he was dispatched to Iraq, seemingly as a Hebrew teacher in a Jewish school in Baghdad, but behind the scene as the first half-time agent to an Arab country.
I think I must have been about 7 or 8 years old in Baghdad. In those days, it was still possible for the Yishuv from Palestine to send teachers to Hebrew schools in Baghdad. And I was in the Shamash school, which is a Hebrew Jewish school. And Zaslani was one of the teachers who came in order to teach Hebrew.
I was the first in the class in Hebrew because I was going to the Cheder in the evening at the same time. Therefore, I was very close to him. I and some other friend suspected that he didn't come to Iraq as a teacher. Teaching only was a cover.
Using this cover, he collects information about Iraqi politics, British-Iraqi relations, and the conditions of the local Jewish community. In 1932, while on a visit to Palestine, he meets Betty Borden, a young woman from a New York Zionist family, whom he is to marry several years later.
I arrived in Palestine, we called it Palestine then, in 1933, and I was 21 years old. I met Reuven through a mutual friend of ours. We saw each other from time to time. I think the meeting was shortly before his second visit to Iraq.
This time he uses the cover of a Palestine Post correspondent. In Baghdad, he helps form a Zionist youth movement, reports on current affairs, and travels incognito to Kurdistan, where he establishes contacts with leaders of the Kurdish national movement. Writing to Betty Borden in Jerusalem, he describes how he is being followed by an Iraqi security officer and how he manages to evade him. Eventually, the true nature of his mission is revealed by the Iraqi authorities, and he is forced to leave the country. On his return to Palestine, my father is brought into the Jewish Agency by head of the political department Dov Hoz. His mission is to establish and run intelligence networks within the Arab community in Palestine. In 1936, the Arab Revolt breaks out. It brings about the need for closer cooperation between the Jewish Agency and British intelligence. Reuven Zaslani is put in charge of liaison with the British services. Ties with British intelligence are very sensitive and complex. As time goes on, a give-and-take relationship is established, concentrating on exchange of information about Arab rebels and bands loyal to the Mufti of Jerusalem. Through his ties with high-ranking British officers, Reuven Shiloah is able to acquire valuable information about British operational and political intentions in Palestine. One of his most important contacts in these days is SSO Chief Patrick Domville.
And I remember one visit in particular that we took together. That was a visit to see the Passover ceremony of the Samaritans in Har Gerizim. At that time, Patrick Domville was part of the group that went up with us to Har Gerizim.
One day in 1938, while Shiloah was in Beirut, he was summoned urgently to Damascus. And the local Jew by the name of David Luzia, who had a cloth factory, told him that the quartermaster of the Arab gang's headquarters in Damascus ordered 300 sets of uniform for the gangsters in Palestine. Shiloah approached the British consul McCarrett, who was the local British agent, and together they organized that the uniforms will be marked by a special sign to enable a follow-up of their path from Damascus to Palestine, which was probably also the path of arms smuggled to the rebels, etc.
In 1936, my father meets and develops special ties with a British intelligence officer named Charles Ord Wingate. Wingate, a Christian, is profoundly influenced by the Old Testament, and through his belief in the Bible and his friendship with Reuven Shiloah, comes to support the Jewish cause. Wingate helps form and train the famous Jewish night squads that are in fact the forerunners of Israel's future commando forces.
Reuven and Betty were invited to dinner along with Captain Charles Ord Wingate, and I guess I was the fourth person invited, and our hostess. And after dinner, the suggestion was made that we play bridge. Reuven wasn't accepting that invitation, so he sat it out. I then told him that I'd been to an Arab village. And he wanted to know what Arab village and who was there and with whom I spoke and what they had to say. And I then became a little nervous because I didn't want to betray any confidences, if there were any.
After the Arab revolt is crushed, the British publish their infamous White Paper, which severely restricts immigration to Palestine by Jews seeking refuge from the Holocaust and prohibits acquisition of land by Jews. This policy reduces overall cooperation with the British, but the intelligence ties remain intact. The outbreak of World War II brings about an intensification of intelligence cooperation. My father is put in charge of the ties between the Jewish Agency and British and American intelligence services. He often travels to Allied headquarters in Cairo. There, he meets a young British intelligence officer named Aubrey Eban and persuades him to become actively involved in the Zionist cause.
The British authorities and the Zionist leadership agreed that I would go to Jerusalem as soon as possible and begin to work in a double capacity as the liaison officer of the British intelligence and simultaneously as somebody who had the confidence of the Zionist leadership. I arrived by train. I was met by Reuven Shiloah.
I think I met him first at Mr. Moshe Sheretz as an intimate meeting with some friends where I saw a British officer addressing us about the Middle Eastern situation in classical Hebrew with Shakespearean intonation. I was very astonished about this apparition, and I asked Moshe Sheret, what is that, who is that? So Moshe Sheret said, that is one of Reuven Shiloah's discoveries.
Faced with the growing threat of a German invasion of Palestine, Reuven Shiloah initiates the creation of a Jewish intelligence network that operates with clandestine communication equipment. He names Moshe Dayan to run the network.
After Moshe being severely wounded in Syria, losing an eye, Moshe had to recuperate in Jerusalem, and we lived in my parents' home, which was flat above the then the Zaslanis, Shiloah. And I must say that Reuven was very, very concerned about Moshe. Moshe was desolate. He was sure that a man with one eye will not be able to get any jobs or work or anything. And I must say that he came up with the wonderful idea that Moshe will be the head of a contingent of people, civilians and Haganah people, that will work behind the lines if the Germans will conquer Palestine.
As news of the Holocaust's awesome dimensions reach Palestine, he concentrates his efforts on persuading the British to use Jewish volunteers for rescue operations inside Nazi-occupied Europe. In order to expand cooperation with the British and help the Allies, the Jewish Agency sets up a special debriefing section in charge of collecting and disseminating information from European Jewish refugees who somehow escape and reach Palestine.
Shiloah, in early 1944, developed what was called at the time the Europe Plan, an ambitious plan to dispatch 250 Palestinian Jews into Hungary and the northern part of Yugoslavia and establish an underground movement, a resistance movement against the Germans.
We had a problem. I think the Israelis had a problem too. We wanted to get people into Bulgaria and Romania with messages, and they wanted to get people out, quite rightly. And so we did whatever we could to help each other in this business of human traffic. And Shiloah Zaslani was the man I had most closely to work with for forged passports and getting people in and out. And he was a very remarkable man.
In 2 weeks I finished my parachuting school, 5 jumps, and 2 days after I jumped my last jump in school, we flew to Bari, and 2 days later from Brindisi to Yugoslavia. Once in a discussion with Hannah Senesh, she said to me, even if they catch me, that will be known to the Jews. They will know that somebody tried to reach them. And we know from survivors that it was true. The rumor that the parachutists from Palestine are coming, grossly exaggerated. Hundreds of parachutists. That was a morale builder of...
Original British military documents, only recently made public, reveal Reuven Zaslani's numerous efforts to send Jewish parachutists alongside British combat intelligence units. The British turned down his repeated and urgent demands, and he is increasingly filled with despair and frustration over the tragic fate of European Jewry.
When the Red Army liberated Romania and Bulgaria, Shiloah felt that he had exhausted himself in this role, and anticipating the significant role which the United States were going to fulfill in the post-war world, including the Middle East, he asked to be dispatched to the United States.
Traveling often to the United States, he renews contacts with senior intelligence officers whom he had met in Europe during the war. He also makes a special effort to forge ties with American Jewish leaders in order to mobilize their support for the Jewish state in the making.
Through our connection with many Jews who had themselves connections with others, we were able sometimes to do things. The simple thing was to collect individual arms which they had kept as souvenirs from their participation in the war, and we sent those to Israel. The more important things were many of the connections that we made through some people who had influence.
At the same time, he continues to conduct intelligence operations in Europe and to serve as an advisor on Arab affairs to Israel's future foreign minister, Moshe Sharet.
At that particular time, Reuven was already living in Tel Aviv and used to come up to Jerusalem during the weekend. Reuven was wounded during the explosion at the Jewish Agency in January, I think it was January or February 1948.
I was sitting in a room with Elias Sasson, the head of the department, Reuven Shiloah, translating a telegram which had arrived from Washington about a very secret meeting with men close to King Abdallah. And as I was translating to Sasson, who didn't know English, Shiloah said to me, if you want to be a diplomat, you have to be exacting. And as he spoke, the whole building fell down on us, walls and ceiling and whatever.
I was in the Jewish Agency. It was the 1st of March 1948. I went to one of the back rooms of Ben Gurion's office.
Chaim Herzog came into the room. Did you have a look at some of these telegrams himself? All of a sudden we heard that huge bang.
An Arab who worked in the American consulate came to deliver some papers to the Jewish Agency. In his car there were explosives, time bombs. He left his car in the courtyard of the Jewish Agency, and at the specified time the bomb went off.
There was a tremendous explosion. The world, as it were, was collapsing.
And there we were, covered with dust.
And there in the swirling dust and smoke that filled the entire corridor, figures began to emerge, looking as if they'd come from the Mars, groping their way. Most of them had been blinded by the glass.
Emerging from that smoke was Reuven Shiloah, Gershon Avner, their faces covered in blood. Both were badly cut.
And there I saw Reuven Shiloah with a huge gash across his face. That was a scar that remained with him till the end. In the course of the rescue operations, I found my wife lying in the ruins, seriously wounded.
The day that Reuven was wounded, he was supposed to have lunch at our house with Chaim Herzog and a member of the UNSCOP delegation. And after the explosion, when Reuven returned home in this very difficult condition, he nevertheless decided that the lunch must go on. And even though the Chaim Herzog's wife had been wounded and Reuven had been wounded, they decided the lunch must go on. This is the spirit we have to show the world.
Off I went with a blood-stained shirt covered in dust and so forth, and apologized to Rosh Lund for my appearance and said we're keeping the date. And then we went to Reuven Shiloah.
It was very difficult to recognize Reuven when he came home that day.
Like the man who never was, completely white, covered in a completely white bandage.
And he had 2 slits for eyes and 2 for his nose and 1 for his mouth.
I couldn't believe it, nor could Rosh Lund. And then Betty, in her usual style, looked after us. And the meal was a very sparse meal because there was no food in Jerusalem at that time. But I can remember there was juice which Reuven could drink through the straw.
Reuven and Chaim Herzog took the UNSCOP representative on a tour of Jerusalem to show him exactly what our position was.
Rosh Lund said he'd like to go to the Jewish Agency. I took him there, and there we found the workers already rebuilding what had been destroyed. Rosh Lund, his eyes filled with tears, turned to me and said, "They will never overcome such a people."
In the 1940s, Reuven Zaslani directs intelligence operations throughout the Arab world. One such operation is Operation Yolande. A dazzling and attractive Jewish woman by the name of Yolande Harmer is a popular member of Cairo's high society. She is recruited by my father to the Zionist cause, and from 1945 on is successful in penetrating not only the inner circles of the Egyptian royal court, but the Arab League as well. One of her most dramatic achievements comes when she manages to get hold of the Arab League plans for the invasion of Palestine.
At the time, I was quite aware of the fact that my mother was engaged in activities which were obviously not official. We had a dark room in the house, and we had visits from people in the agency all the time. It never occurred to me that this was classical spying activity. And I can remember many meetings with Reuven being held with my mother in Reuven's house, of which I was unaware of the content because I was in other parts of the apartment talking to Betty or others. In January 1948, I was 13 and at school in Egypt when my mother went to Jerusalem. I didn't know specifically who she'd seen other than BG or what the deep content of that conversation was, which I found out about 40 years later when the Ministry of Defense declassified some documents in which the rather dramatic story of her having been asked by BG to give her the plans of the Arab League army's invasions, and that she brought them with her.
When we arrived in Tel Aviv, we did not have any housing arrangements. We lived in the Ketedan Hotel for some weeks. Reuven was extremely busy. He had practically no time for us. I was pregnant at the time, and I was to give birth in another few months. My parents kept sending cables that I must come to America. Reuven persuaded me and said, look, there's no possibility for you to remain here. It's much better that you go to the United States. You're looked after. So I did fly to the United States with my son, and Naomi was born there.
In the course of Israel's War of Independence, there were several serious intelligence failures. My father realizes that the pre-state intelligence arm of the Haganah is unable to deal with the new realities. In June 1948, he proposes to Prime Minister Ben-Gurion to appoint Chaim Herzog to draw up plans for a military intelligence agency.
By August 1948, I presented a plan for the complete organization of military intelligence in the Israel Defense Forces to the General Staff. It was approved, and since then, and became the basis on which our renowned military intelligence was based. Here, as I say, Reuven played a very, very important part.
During this period, my father changes our surname from Zaslani to Shiloah, which was his underground code name. Towards the end of 1948, my father, together with Lieutenant Colonel Moshe Dayan, hold a series of talks with the Jordanian military governor of East Jerusalem, Abdallah al-Tal. His ability to have and maintain a dialogue with Arab counterparts make him later a central figure at the armistice negotiations in Rhodes and Lausanne.
אני צורפתי למשא ומתן כמה ימים אחרי תחילתו כנציג חזית הדרום, הכוחות שלחמו נגד המצרים, וכידוע המהלכים שם היו יותר פשוטים מאשר אחר כך הרבה שנים לאחר מכן. ישבנו שתי משלחות סביב שולחן אחד, כולל שיחות בלתי פורמליות, ולראובן שילוח היה את התפקיד כל הזמן לשבת בחדרים נפרדים, לשוחח עם הנציגים המצריים. הוא פחות עסק בצד המודיעיני הצבאי, הוא עסק הרבה יותר ופיתח הרבה יותר את הצד המודיעיני המדיני.
On December 13th, 1949, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion appoints Reuven Shiloah to head the Mossad for coordinating all intelligence services. He is directly responsible to the Prime Minister. At the same time, he continues to serve as special advisor to Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet and play a key role in the secret negotiations with King Abdullah of Jordan.
Usually we used to go on Friday night, and we suffered from stones that were thrown on us from the neighboring Jewish Orthodox people that were living there in Mea Shearim. So we managed with the chief of police of Jerusalem to take us in a sort of a, let me call it, a prisoner car.
He went at night and came back early in the morning. I rarely slept that night for fear of what could happen to him or might have happened to him.
He used to go always with a hidden small pistol. I don't know, he was very suspicious, but yet he used to take it.
On the other hand, it was a very thrilling experience because one thought, oh, maybe this will be some sort of peace for us, a peace for Jordan at the very beginning.
I met the king practically till the last week of his life. He was a very cultured man. He was a writer, first-class writer. He used to write poems in Arabic, always.
I still remember the young Sassoon then asked the king, "May I have a question to ask, Your Majesty?" So the king paused for a minute and he said, "Yes, what do you want?" He said, "Why are you interested in making peace with us? Why are you so tolerant? Why are you so understanding?" The king looked at him and he put his hand on his shoulder. He was standing on a lower step than the king. The king was up. And he told him, "Listen, my son, if I don't do this, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of wars in the future. And in those wars, both of us are going to lose. But I'm afraid to say that the bigger loser would be the Arabs."
I could feel that he trusted Reuven and that he was very sincere in the way that he talked to him. And Reuven was very free with him. I mean, he could speak with him as if he's speaking to really an older, very, very good friend that could be trusted.
Shiloah was a man of diplomacy. He was refined, he was intelligent, he was tactful. He counted 10 before he uttered a word.
The feeling was that they had reached a point where they were already had initialed a paper.
It was noon, Friday. I knew the king is going to pray in the mosque of Al-Aqsa, and I wanted to hear what exactly would the imam say in front of the king. I was listening, and suddenly I hear one shot.
I was with him in the mosque, and he fell in my arms. That's the king, that's me with the tarbouch, that's the mufti, and that's the governor of Jerusalem. And all the crowds were following us on our way to the mosque. King Abdullah's life ended 5 minutes after this picture was taken.
Reuven was in great distress at the time. I don't recall exactly what happened, but I know there was this terrible feeling that Reuven had that we've been set back. You know, this was a step forward and a step backward, so to speak.
Today, it is difficult to comprehend the wide range of Reuven Shiloah's activities. While negotiating with heads of state, he deals with chiefs of foreign intelligence services, continues to work in the operational field, and reports directly to Israel's decision makers.
I remember mainly when I came back from Syria and Lebanon in early 48, and he was already in the position that we had to report to him. Out of all people that I met when I used to come back from my underground activities, he was the one with whom I knew that when I had to meet him, I had to be very careful, very precise. He was one of the learned people, and he knew the area, I believe, more than anyone else that I met in those days.
I worked with Shiloah about 2.5 years. I don't see another man work so hard in so many hours in a day. When he have a job to do in the north, he take with him in the car people because he have no time to sit with so many people who would want to see him and report him.
In early 1950s, a new top-secret agency is created. Its main tasks are to maintain ties with the Jews behind the Iron Curtain and to collect information about the Soviet Union, particularly on Soviet Jewry. This agency, later named Nativ, helps prepare the ground for the mass Jewish immigration from communist Russia. A lecture by Reuven Shiloah to the graduating class of the Intelligence College in 1952 sheds light on his philosophy regarding the role of Israel's intelligence. We are charged with tasks not given to intelligence services in most democracies. We must be ready for a second round, which means not only obtaining information about the Arab countries, but knowing what's what inside nations that meddle in the Middle East out of self-interest. Besides this awareness, international borders must not be an obstacle for us, and moreover, our concerns are not only for the state of Israel, but with the welfare of Jews around the world. In the early 50s, the Israeli intelligence community included military intelligence, the General Security Service, the political department, operating from within the foreign ministry, responsible for all intelligence activities outside Israel. Reuven Shiloah is responsible for coordinating between the three agencies and reporting directly to the Prime Minister.
And he had free access, not only to Sharet, but to other leaders of the government, to Ben-Gurion with all differences and discrepancies. Whenever there was a divergence of opinion, he used to go from each one to another, try to reconciliate and find common denominator for a joint policy, whether it is in the sphere of towards the Arab countries or towards the United States, or something to do with the defense or intelligence.
I think he was very careful not to take sides and not to disappoint either of the two of them. I don't think he was a great gossiper, and he was really devoted completely to the issues more than to the relations.
In 1950, Reuven Shiloah introduces a series of changes in the operational codes and procedures of the political department. His reforms create dissent and are opposed by most of the senior staff. Members of the political department claim that he is an inefficient director who neglects his subordinates, is unwilling to delegate authority, and is often absent due to other duties. This leads to what later becomes known as the Spies' Revolt in the political department.
At the beginning of 1951, started talks in Israel on the establishment of a superior organ of intelligence to which the various intelligence organizations should be submitted to them. And we in the Cabinet, we thought that the intelligence abroad should be more influenced by political instances than by military instances. But finally the decision was taken.
הנושא של המחלקה המדינית וההתחרות שהיה בין המודיעין הצבאי ובין המחלקה המדינית היה מקור לדאגה לסכנה אפילו. מכיוון שאם לא היה מי שיכריע בוויכוחים האלה, אז ברור שנוצר מצב של סכנה וגם של חוסר תיאום בתחום הרגיש ביותר, התחום של הפעילות החשאית.
When Prime Minister Ben-Gurion is confronted with this crisis, he gives Reuven Shiloah his full support, and in March 1951 he orders him to reorganize Israeli intelligence activities abroad.
But at that time relations became quite tense, and I thought, I knew of course Shiloah very well, I thought there must be another instance, higher instance, when Shiloah says no, and he doesn't even explain why, there should be somebody to whom one could address oneself. And I went to see David Ben-Gurion. When Shiloah found out, then he decided to cut relations, and then he went to Sharet and said he can't work with me anymore. And Sharet said, when two Turkish officers quarrel, you have to divide between themselves, and then he told me I was out. And then some of the main operators of the political department decided to resign.
Once I asked Ben-Gurion how he could allow over 20 people to leave the department in one go. He said, you cannot build a country by the threat of a handful of people. Therefore, he accepted the resignation. As a result, Reuven Shiloah was obliged to rebuild the whole department from scratch.
On July 23, 1952, a dramatic event takes place in Egypt. A group called the Free Officers ousts King Farouk and seizes power. Reuven Shiloah attempts to open a covert channel to the new Egyptian rulers and their leader, a shrewd and ambitious young officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser, but to no avail.
In the beginning of the state, Israel adopted the non-identification policy, meaning that Israel was neutral between West and East. And Ben-Gurion at that time wanted to tilt the policy towards the West, and especially the United States. Around him were several people who supported his policy, and this was Teddy Kollek, Ehud Avriel, and Reuven Shiloah, among others. When Ben-Gurion came to the United States in May '51 in order to establish the Bonds for Israel organization, Teddy Kollek arranged for him to meet Bill Smith, who was the head of the CIA at the time. And since that meeting, working relations started between our intelligence and the CIA. And I became the first liaison officer on our part, and Jim Angleton was the liaison officer on the part of the CIA. Working there in Washington with the CIA, I had a lot of contacts with Reuven Shiloah, both when he used to come to the United States or when I came to Israel.
In the spring of 1952, my father is seriously hurt in a car accident on the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road. He recovers and returns to direct the Mossad, but several unfortunate events undermine his authority. The fall of the Mossad network in Iraq, the uncovering of a KGB mole in Israel's foreign ministry, and the embarrassing Dan Pines affair.
He was the chief editor of perhaps the most important Israeli daily in those days. He came to Israel from Russia after Russia became part of the Soviet Union. And he pretended that he got a coded message from an old friend of his who became a very important man in the Soviet bureaucracy, who asked to meet him in a clandestine way. He called Reuven Shiloah, and Reuven Shiloah became responsible for the operation of meeting that man. Isser Harel suspected the whole story as a fake, and it came out that it's a fake. Reuven Shiloah did another mistake. He went and told Jim Angleton, chief operator of the CIA, the story, and he sold the story as a potential source, a very important potential source in Moscow. After it became clear that it's a fake, of course we were ridiculous. First of all, in our eyes, probably also in the eyes of the CIA.
At the end of 1952, my father resigns as head of the Mossad and from his other intelligence duties. He, who played a major role in preparing and creating Israel's intelligence community, finds himself thrust aside when Israel's intelligence and political frameworks are officially defined.
It was difficult for him to accept that he had to abandon, to leave the intelligence community. I think he suffered from this frustration for the rest of his life.
Reuven Shiloah moves on to the next chapter of his life. At his own request, he is nominated to the post of minister at the Israeli embassy in Washington. There he operates alongside Ambassador Abba Eban, the same Eban recruited by Reuven Shiloah to the Zionist cause 10 years earlier in Cairo.
Reuven's appointment as number 2 at the Washington embassy as minister was some surprise to some of us because his seniority and his status in the foreign service would have enabled him to be number 1, to be ambassador and head of mission wherever he would have wanted. But apparently he preferred to be number 2 at the most important place to being number 1 at some less central position.
John Foster Dulles had a special interest in what Reuven had to say. Dulles himself came to his office without much knowledge about the Middle East, and Reuven's background and his detailed knowledge of the Arab landscape these were very useful assets.
In Washington, Reuven Shiloah confronts a critical, if not hostile, Republican administration led by President Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. He invests a great deal of energy in establishing ties with influential contacts and sources in the White House and on Capitol Hill. He is among those who initiates and pursues the concept of creating a strategic alliance between the United States and Israel based on mutual ideas and common interests.
I became an important source for Reuven of trying to communicate to him what I understood about the structure of the White House. One of the things I did for Reuven was to introduce him to Arthur Burns. He was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And Burns liked Reuven. But being officially a part of the administration, I think he was cautious to what he was able to say.
On the 29th of October 1956, news of the Suez War or Sinai Campaign breaks while he is at a meeting with senior U.S. officials at the State Department. The Americans refuse to believe that the high-ranking Israeli diplomat knows nothing about the attack against Egypt.
Reuven was desperately in need of getting into contact with people high in the Republican Party that could conceivably influence the president so that he would at least be a little bit less unfriendly than he was.
I think Shiloah was most instrumental in '57 in ending the Sinai campaign and in withdrawing from Sinai and Gaza under the best possible conditions. At the time at which Ben-Gurion had reached the conclusion that if we wanted to reap the results of the Sinai campaign, we had to withdraw in order to open the Gulf of Aqaba. And Eban and Shiloah were working together, negotiating with John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, and preparing a speech that Golda was to make at the United Nations. Eban and Shiloah worked like twins. They were a real team. One had the ideas and one drafted the sentences.
At the end of 1957, after 5 years in Washington, Reuven Shiloah returns to Jerusalem, where he is appointed as special political advisor to Foreign Minister Golda Meir. As part of his effort to break through Israel's isolation in the Middle East, he tries together with Director General of the Ministry of Defense, Shimon Peres, to get Israel accepted into NATO.
And then Ben-Gurion sent Mr. Shiloah and myself to make a tour in the countries who are members of NATO to try to convince them to accept us. So there we went together for days and nights and we were talking together. I think the most complicated answers regard to the Scandinavian countries for the simple reason they didn't want to extend NATO. They thought that NATO is already overloaded with problems.
The jewel in Reuven Shiloah's crown of achievements were his last years, in which he buttressed and fortified Israel's relationship with its peripheral states, which means Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia. Israel's political situation at that time was not very bright. We were after the Sinai campaign. We were doomed by the third world countries as imperialists, as collaborators of France and Britain. We were hated by our Arab neighbors. Reuven Shiloah oversaw all this and understood that the only way to jump over the fences of hatred is to try and find an anchor of friendship with the peripheral state. At this he endeavored a great deal, finding for each and every country of the three, Iran, Ethiopia, and Turkey, the best intimate partner and the best niche in which we could sow our seeds.
I believe it was beginning of 1958 that Reuven called me in. He was at that time at the Foreign Ministry. I was here in Jerusalem, and started talking to me about the idea about the periphery. At the end of this conversation, he asked me whether I would be prepared to go to Ethiopia as our representative. I left for Ethiopia in May 1958. Reuven came and visited us in Ethiopia on an official visit in which he also met the emperor. It was in 1959. 2 days after his arrival, something very unfortunate happened, namely there was a coup d'etat in Khartoum. Reuven stayed at our house. He actually was sitting for 24 hours a day near the radio to try and listen in Arabic to all the broadcasts, not only from Sudan, but mainly from Saudi and from Egypt, all the news, and obviously there was a great deal of tension. In spite of this tension, or probably in order to release this tension, Reuven was certainly a different Reuven from the one which you met in office hours. Reuven who had a great deal of charm, a great deal of jokes.
One of the most promising areas was Iran. They were willing to cooperate fully with Israel at the time. Reuven came to me and suggested that we go together to Iran. Then suddenly he was ill. He'd flown 35 times that year all over the world in planes of that period, living on coffee and cigarettes. And in the final analysis, it just got him down.
I saw him at about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, at the night before he died. And he looked well. He was very cheerful. He told me that he expected to leave the hospital within a day or two. And it was quite a shock the following morning when I got a telephone call that Reuven died during the night.
And that was the end of a great life, of an unusual person.
I have, as everybody at my age would have, lost a great number of friends during the last few years. I think the one I'm missing most is Reuven. Of course, this didn't happen recently. I remember still when I visited him in hospital after his heart attack, and when he never left there anymore. And that was a very long time ago, but he was a great loss.
He was very controversial. There were people who liked him very, very much. Nobody was indifferent to him. They either liked him very much or they disliked him very much.
Reuven Shiloah did not enter a room like a normal person. A normal person knocks at the door, you say come in, and he opens the door and he comes in. He would half open the door, poke his head round the corner, look around to see who and what was in the room, and then he would come in, slowly.
The story is told that he once got into a cab in London.
And he told the driver, go.
The cab driver said to him with typical courtesy,
where to?
And Reuven said,
it's a secret, can't tell you.
Sir, that's not your business. I do not want to be investigated.
appear and disappear, appear and disappear. And I could never anticipate when he'd be there, when he wouldn't be there. When he came, he always came back with sweets, and I like sweets since that day. We used to hide them, I used to eat them, and those were a sign that he had been home. I can't remember we ever went on a journey together, the whole family. I remember many holidays when he wasn't around.
Even when he was at home, he wasn't with us in the sense that he was very busy, occupied, running off to meetings, traveling, preparing for trips and other trips. From that point of view, it wasn't a normal childhood. On the other hand, there were all sorts of highlights which accompanied his non-presence, and that was when he was there, he was completely there at home. He was at home. I was exposed as a kid to all sorts of aspects of life which other kids from my age group, my friends, were never exposed to. I had gone with him to meet David Ben-Gurion. That was unbelievable. I knew Moshe Sharet almost as a child on a first name basis.
Well, I think his philosophy of life was there's so little time and there's so much to do. The time is always running out against us. I may more or less have accepted that. I think that's one of the reasons that I always had a career.
היה לו חוש חד, חריף, לנושא המודיעיני, אבל זה היה גם מודיעין וגם חיפושי מגע עם הגורמים שאיתם אתה נמצא בעימות.
When Reuven Shiloah, though he understood perfectly well that at war we have to win, he also understood that the greatest triumph will be peace and not just a military victory.
My father dies in 1959 at the age of 49. It is a tragic and untimely end to the life of a man who almost always worked in the shadows. He was one of those people who placed their dedication to the state before anything else and gave everything he had to accomplish what he believed was his mission. Only as time passed, I began to understand his sense of great urgency, his total commitment, and his accomplishments, some of which still have a bearing on Israel's intelligence and national strategies.